Well, good afternoon and welcome to those joining from the UK and from those joining from the US, a good morning. Welcome to what I'm sure is going to be a really informative and engaging discussion on NatCen's recent publication comparing UK and US attitudes on social and political change. For those that don't know NatCen, we're the National Centre for Social Research, the UK's largest social survey provider to the UK government and devolved administrations and academia across housing, transport, health, finance, crime, or simply growing up, or perhaps not. More often than not, it's NatCen's expertise and capability that is driving the insight and the data. Our goal is to listen to society without an agenda, revealing issues that matter and helping identify solutions that work through the power of understanding. In today's webinar, we're looking at a side-by-side of UK and US public attitudes on social and political change. Up front, I'd like to thank our guests who I'll briefly introduce in turn. So firstly, may I thank Peter Foster from the Financial Times for helping shape this idea in the first place, which was hatched with the thought to what extent are UK attitudes and US attitudes in the wake of the election of President Trump beginning to align. Then thank you to Curtis Jessup for rightly rolling his eyes and taking such an ill-informed sentiment and turning it into a proper research proposal. Thank you to Jocelyn Kiley from Pew in allowing NatCen to then take their questionnaire and to replicate it here in the UK. And she's able to attend to give the US perspective, which is, just brilliant. And then lastly, thank you to Sophie Stowers from More in Common, who's recently completed an analysis of Reform voters. And last but by no means least, to Mark Easton, our newest senior fellow and former BBC Home Affairs editor, who recently spoke at an all-Stafford event, and perhaps sometimes, despite the gloom, always offers a note of optimism. So we're going to finish with Mark, so that hopefully we finish on a note of optimism in terms of the sort of changes that we're all going through. So without further delay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over to Curtis. Curtis is NatCen's Director of Attitudinal Research. He has responsibility for the British Social Attitude Survey and the NatCen panel, which was the UK's first open mixed mode random probability panel. So Curtis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. I'm not sure if I remember rolling my eyes per se. I'm sure I engaged thoroughly and in what's going to be what I think is a really, really interesting topic area. Let me just set myself up so we can see my slides. Hopefully you can all see that. Somebody shout if not. So thanks for that introduction. As Michael says, my name's Curtis Jessup. I'm the Director of Attitudinal Surveys here at NatCen, and I'm going to be giving us a top-level view of the findings from some of the analysis that was conducted by my colleagues, Alex and Susan, to hopefully set us up well for an interesting discussion this afternoon. I'm going to sort of start by summarising how attitudes in the two countries compare at the national level, before focusing a little bit more on the political divisions and the extent to which Reform voters and Trump supporters have comparable views. But just to set, I guess, a little bit more context for why we decided to run this project, last year we saw a Labour government elected into power for the first time in 14 years. Winning with a large parliamentary majority, but today the tides of politics, or British politics at least, seem to have shifted, with Reform UK now consistently topping polls for voting intention, and that followed on, I suppose, from Donald Trump's election to the US presidency for the second time in November last year. And that sort of got us to thinking, I suppose, that there are a number of similarities, perhaps, between the rise of Reform in the UK and Trump in the US. So on policy, they both combine a tough approach to immigration with a preference for smaller government and protectionism. They also represent an insurgency, or some might call an insurgency, from the right against what what you might call the established political order, the dominant parties in the UK, the established Republican Party in the United States, and there are, of course, personal connections between Trump and Reform UK's leader Nigel Farage. And I suppose it was in that context that Michael and Peter sort of asked that question, and we wanted to have a look at the extent to which attitudes in the UK are or are not aligning with those that helped to deliver Trump to his second term in office, or in other words, could Farage's UK look like Trump's America? And to answer this question, we designed a study to replicate in the UK questions that have previously been asked as part of 2 studies in the US, which explored public attitudes on a diverse range of topics, including immigration, racial equality, the appropriate size and role of government, protectionism, free trade, crime, gender, and the family. Our main source of US data was Wave 146. Of the American Trends Panel, conducted early last year by the Pew Research Center, so ahead of the US election. Though we also draw some data from the ANES, which conducted fieldwork in late 2024 and early 2025. We conducted our survey in the UK this summer using sample from the NatCen opinion panel, and as such, when we're making our comparisons here, we're mostly comparing somewhat contemporary views in the UK with the views in the US in the run-up to the US election. All the surveys involved used high-quality designs, which go beyond sort of your typical commercial polling, most notably through the use of probability-based sampling. And we replicated the original questions as closely as we could, making small adjustments to account for country and topic-specific differences where we thought it was appropriate, but as much as possible trying to keep the question wording as similar as possible. So, on to the findings. To get us started, how do the views of adults in the UK and the US compare? So, first looking at attitudes on immigration, we see that people in the UK generally hold more conservative views than in the US. We found that people in the UK were more likely than people in the US to think that immigrants who are living in the country without permission should not be allowed to stay, and less likely to think that the country's openness to people from all over the world is essential to who we are. We find a similar pattern on attitudes to ethnic diversity more generally, so beyond immigration. People in the US were more likely to say that their society is strengthened by being made up of people from different ethnic backgrounds than people in the UK, and less likely to say that white people declining as a share of the population is bad for society. Now, of course, the US is significantly more ethnically diverse than the UK. Around 57% of the US population is from a non-Hispanic white background, compared to nearly 3/4 of people living in England and Wales who have a white British background. But while those demographic differences do explain some of why Americans hold more liberal views on immigration and diversity, it's not the whole story, at least not directly. And when we break down attitudes by ethnicity, we see that white Brits are still less liberal on these issues when we're just comparing them directly to white Americans. So regardless of the reasons for the divergence, the different ethnic composition of the UK and the US certainly doesn't seem to fully explain the divergent attitudes between the 2 countries. That said, a more socially conservative UK and a more liberal US is not the story across the board, at least not from this survey. And moving on to social issues, we can see that people in the UK are broadly more socially progressive than people in the US. They're more likely to support same-sex marriage and abortion being legal, and less likely to think society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. As with attitudes to immigration and diversity, we did explore whether these differences are due to differences in socio-demographic profiles of the UK and the US. So specifically, we know that a greater proportion of people in the US are religious. Around 62% of US adults report being Christian, compared to 46% of those living in England and Wales. And our data show that the attitudes on these topics are really highly correlated with religious belief. But again, as with our attitudes to immigration and diversity, when we dig into the data, we also see that religious people in the US hold more conservative views than their religious counterparts in the UK. And Given that, we can't say that the divergence in attitudes between the UK and the US are sort of purely the result of differences in religiosity. Finally, we have a look here at attitudes to the size and role of the state, where we found that people in the UK are more supportive of a larger and more active government. In the UK, a majority of people said they would prefer a bigger government providing more services over a smaller one providing fewer services, while Americans, on the other hand, were more divided, with around half preferring a smaller state. Likewise, a majority of the UK population think that government should be doing more to solve problems, with those in the US split broadly evenly between that opinion and a more laissez-faire view that government is doing too many things which are better left to businesses and individuals. Finally, while the majority of both UK and US participants feel the government regulation of business is necessary to protect the public interest, people in the US are more likely than people in the UK to think that it does more harm than good. However, despite this greater support for a larger government, UK citizens were actually more likely to think that the state is poorly managed, with around 2/3 of Brits feeling that government is almost always wasteful and inefficient, compared with 57% of Americans. So overall, the UK is not therefore in the same place as the US when it comes to public attitudes on important policy issues. While the UK is notably more liberal than the US on issues such as same-sex marriage, abortion, and the importance of the family, it is more conservative, more right-wing in its attitudes towards immigration. When it comes to the role of the government, we find that people in the UK are more supportive of a larger state, but they're also less likely to think it's doing a good job. So, moving quickly on, how are these views distributed across supporters of different parties? Even if opinion differs between the UK and the US on many of these issues, are the views of reform voters and those who supported Trump more aligned? So, going across the issues and taking immigration and diversity first, we find that with both reform voters and Trump supporters sitting to the right of people in the UK and the US as a whole, the gaps between those two groups are similar to the gaps that we saw between the UK and the US. So, in other words, reform voters have consistently more hardline views than Trump supporters, in the same way that members of the UK public have consistently more hardline views than members of the US public. And this leads to actually some quite large gaps in opinion. So, for example, reform voters are very unlikely to say that ethnic diversity strengthens British society, and very likely to think that white people declining as a share of the population is bad for society. But Trump supporters are actually pretty evenly split on these measures. This pattern of the gaps between reform voters and Trump supporters, reflecting the gaps between the views of the UK and the US population, is also seen in our other measures. So while both reform voters and Trump supporters are generally more socially conservative than the UK and the US, Trump supporters are consistently more likely to take a conservative stance than reform voters on issues of importance of family and abortion and same-sex marriage, to the extent actually that the balance of opinion is actually reversed on some of these issues. We see the same thing on economic issues as well. Trump supporters show consistent support for less intervention from the state, and while reform voters are more right-leaning than others in the UK, they are much more balanced in their opinion than Trump supporters are. So, overall, we see that across all three of these topic areas, both reform voters and Trump supporters are more socially conservative than the UK and US populations, respectively. And if anything, because of this, we see the same gaps that we saw between the UK and US populations as a whole appearing between the reform and Trump supporters, albeit shifted to the right, rather than an alignment of opinion between supporters of two right-leaning parties based in different countries. In some instances, these gaps appear to create meaningful differences in the attitudes of the two parties' supporters, rather than just being more or less extreme versions of the same opinion. So, to quickly conclude and maybe set us up for a little bit of discussion, these data highlight meaningful differences between attitudes in the UK and the US, and between Trump supporters and reform voters. And while immigration stands out as a clear area of division in both countries for reform, unless they can bring people with them, pursuing Trumpian, socially conservative or small state policies may risk alienating voters in the UK. They are not currently consistently supported by their own voters based on these data, yet alone those who voted for other parties in the UK, who tend to be more liberal. Thank you.
Curtis, thank you. Sorry, I didn't get my camera back on. Jocelyn, firstly, thank you for working with Curtis on this. Thank you for allowing us to have access to your data. So really look forward to your perspective on this.
Well, great. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you taking this data and doing something new and interesting with it, and in using it as a way to pull out some comparative analysis. As Curtis mentioned, this is our data from before the 2024 election. We actually collected it in the spring of 2024, and we analyzed it through the lens of people who were at the time intending to vote for Trump or Biden, and then later on we analyzed it through the lens of intent to vote for Harris. Notably, there really were no differences between the Biden voters and the Harris voters. There's quite a lot of overlap there. That's a topic for another day, of course. But and I think a lot of the findings in this report, I think, probably confirm many instincts some of us have, but we are data-driven beings, and we want to test those instincts against real data. So, I will talk more about the U.S. dynamics. That's my area of expertise. But I'll start with, the report elucidates that polarization's in full force in both countries, and really, but that those dynamics are different. And I think one of the core point around issues of immigration, national identity, and especially in the U.S., we would in many cases put race and diversity in that bucket, is not just a story in the U.S. and the U.K., and it's not a static story, right? So this is a trend story over the last 15 or 20 years. And what I mean by that is, in the US, there have long been divides between Republicans and Democrats on any number of issues, including on these sorts of issues: immigration, views of the nation, diversity, and so forth. But the extent of those divides today is much, much wider than it was, say, 20 years ago. And this is for a number of reasons. I can go into more detail, but some of it is what we call partisan sorting, right? Meaning that people who held one view, who were more pro-immigration, there might have been more of those folks in the Republican Party 20 years ago, and those folks kind of have refound themselves as more associated with Democrats, and vice versa. But there are other things going on, including that one of the things we saw over the course of, say, 2000 to 2015 or so, is that the Democrats really moved, and Democrats really moved in a more liberalizing direction on some of these issues. And it's less necessarily that the Republican group moved in a more conservative direction, but those gaps opened up as a result of that. And I think one thing I like to hammer home is that Trump and Trump's rise in 2015, his first administration, obviously his reelection in 2024, that took place against a backdrop of this polarization. It was not the driver of this polarization. We really have seen these dynamics for some time before that. But one of the differences is in making those divides on immigration salient, making immigration salient as an issue. And I think that's one of the big contrasts, for instance, in the US between the context of the 2020 election and the 2024 election. In the 2020 election, immigration was not a particularly salient issue, though the underlying divides were there. It was much more of a salient issue in 2024 against a backdrop of growing asylum claims at the end, and refugees at the U.S.-Mexico border, and so forth. And that pivots me to talking about ways that the U.S. and the U.K. might be different. Of course, both countries and several other European countries and other countries around the world have confronted increased migration, increased immigration, but those dynamics are different, right? What the sending countries, when those events happen, and so forth. And I think that has also resulted in just different times when these issues arise on the public agenda. And Curtis also noted that the baseline attitudes on these issues in the US are perhaps somewhat more progressive than the UK, and I think rightly points to the greater racial and ethnic diversity in the US, as well as an ethos in the country, right? The US talks about itself, at least historically, as a nation of immigrants. That is obviously under contention right now, and the policies of the current administration are potentially in the opposite direction. And what's interesting, actually, I'll nod to the work that we're currently doing and my colleagues are doing, keeping track of attitudes about immigration policy today in the US, is there's a lot of what we call thermostatic opinion on this issue, perhaps a feeling that the last administration was too liberal, too progressive on these issues, but maybe a sense that the current administration has gone too far, is too conservative on these issues, and really that the American public wants a balance and doesn't necessarily find it in our polarized political system. But I'll stop there on that issue and just briefly talk about some of the other the dynamics. Curtis and team are very right to point out, in the US, we do have really entrenched deep divisions between, Trump voters and Harris voters, between Republicans and Democrats. Those are largely the same thing, but not exactly the same thing. And these align on a ton of different dimensions in a way that really is a contrast to the UK. You point to abortion. That's an incredibly divided issue. It's not always the most salient issue in American politics, but it's ever present. Certainly, the role of government has long divided Republicans from Democrats, and we see in the policy of the administration real attempts and successes at cutting the size of government, and that's really that lands very differently for Democratic voters than for Republican voters. And this extends to views of what we would call the social safety net, views of healthcare, support for the poor. You may know about the US government shutdown that just ended recently, that was more than a month long. And the reason for that shutdown, at least the stated reason for that shutdown, was around extension of health insurance subsidies, subsidies for what many of you may know as Obamacare. That's the Affordable Care Act that was passed more than a decade ago, or roughly a decade ago. So that's a very different divide than you see in the UK, and that's without even touching on some of the other really hot button divided issues in the US. Right? For instance, I know that it's hardly a debate in the UK around guns and gun attitudes. It's an enormous dividing line in the US. Similarly, climate change and the environment really splits the two parties in the US in a way that I know it doesn't in other countries. So there really are there are some similarities, but as Curtis pointed out, there are a lot of differences. So I'll wrap up just to say we are constantly tracking opinion in these areas. This is our values study from last year. We'll have more coming up in the new year. I alluded to how we're watching immigration attitudes in the US right now. And certainly we're also watching attitudes about topics like trade and the size of government. And then finally, one of the other, I'll throw some fodder for discussion. There are a lot of other reasons why polarization, the nature of divides between parties or coalitions are different in the two countries. Some of it might be the nature of our systems, right? We really fundamentally have a two-party system in the US. And another really important and interesting one is the nature of the media environments. So that's changing all around, I'm sure, but I think for many years we've had a very polarized media environment in the U.S. I think in a way that is unique or in contrast to some other media environments, including the UK. So with that, I won't take more time. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Justine. I love this concept of the thermostatic response, so that politicians do one thing and then the public reacts and thinks, well, maybe that's a bit too much and perhaps we'd like a little less. I also think that you've set up a couple of really interesting points for both Peter, Mark, and Sophie in terms of, is our media in this country becoming more or less polarized? So I'm going to pass over to Peter. Just to, for Peter's sake, Peter's come back from a business trip with an incredible cold. So I promise you, as you'll hear, Peter is not how he normally sounds, but he's going to battle on. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know if my camera is working, Michael. Right, I'm going to press on. Hopefully you can all hear me, and apologies now for the croakiness. Oh, I think I am going to start my video. All working rather slowly.
That's
right,
it.
now I'm there. We're good. This apologies for croakiness and for snottiness, unavoidable. When we initially kind of conceived this survey, part of it was driven by the fact that UK media and politics has become actually increasingly polarized. And as a former Washington correspondent, when I came back to the UK after 20 years away in 2015-16, I was actually struck by how similar in lots of ways UK political and media environment had become to the United States, even though it wasn't often recognized by people, by the politicians and the media operating in it, quite how Trumpian, for want of a word, our media had become. So it was actually really interesting to see this data because the Farages and the Badnocks of this world would go and cuddle up with CPAC and American Enterprise Institute, and they'd come back and they'd often, I thought, come up with sort of culture war tropes, often on Middle East and Gaza, for example, or on culture war stuff that felt slightly alien to the UK. And in lots of ways that this research rather bears that out, that on gay marriage, on abortion, for example, as you'd expect, the kind of religiosity of the United States means there's a kind of real difference of opinion there. Interestingly, I think on the trans piece, there's real alignment on the attitudes in the UK and the US, and I think that speaks to, and I'd be interested to see what Sophie has on this. The kind of that issue is not only a kind of post-religious issue. Forgive me, a post-religious issue, but one that really spoke to this idea that the liberal establishment, the Kamala Harrises and the left progressive parties in the UK, had really kind of lost touch with what ordinary people felt. And I think that's borne out in the data, that that issue became a talisman for those who sort of felt that the liberal establishment had got so up itself and it just lost track of the kind of what most ordinary people think, which was that sex is the way you're born, notwithstanding the fact that some people want to identify with a different sex, but the fact that the kind of mainstreaming of that was I think became a proxy for another issue, which was the left divorcing itself from reality. On the immigration stuff, I think everybody was quite shocked by quite how hard over the British right is. 70-80% really saying that our society is weakened by diversity. And so insofar as there's a market for anti-immigrant rhetoric in politics, I think what this shows is that actually Farage and friends maybe have a bigger market than Trump, even though Trump's made a massive thing about shutting the border and sending SWAT teams into Chicago to clear out apartment blocks. And I think probably I'm right in saying that for a lot of establishment liberals, whatever, these numbers are quite surprising. We always used to think that the populist right in the UK had a sort of ceiling of 15%. The UKIP, or the Brexit Party, was sort of topped out there. But we see Reform now going at 30% in the polls, and it raises a question about whether or not we're in one of those thermostatic cycles that was alluded to, or whether actually once the debate shifts and actually gives people permission to espouse these views, knowing that the liberal establishment view on whether it's the death penalty or immigration is always more liberal than the actual popular view, but even allowing for that, whether or not actually the ceiling is genuinely higher now. We saw this week Farage saying that he was going to cut 25 billion out of the budget and the foreigners were going to pay for it. No, even though most people know that the NHS, our National Health Service, is propped up by foreigners. The prison service, which is in a terrible state, actually propped up by people from West Africa who come and work as prison guards. And that narrative is missing from politics. And I think the othering of foreigners as a vehicle for kind of driving support to the right is a really interesting and dangerous phenomenon. And we saw different spikes in migration, didn't we, in 2015 or so? But these numbers, I think, raise a really interesting question, and it'd be really interesting to see what Sophie has to say about where Reform voters actually are. We know that they're basically Brexit voters, but the extent to which these numbers suggest the anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner tropes are so strong that there's kind of more mileage there, not less, which is presumably why Farage is doing what he's doing. On small government, large government, I think there's just a tension there between, the Thatcherites, who, the American Enterprise Institute types, and the essentially often blue-collar Reform voters who are closer to the state because actually they're closer to the socioeconomic demographics that rely more on the state, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of them actually often quite rightly think the state doesn't function very well. On the last piece, which is the whole question about social welfare and social contract, and the extent to which sort of young people think that more people ought to be left to stand on their own 2 feet. I read that as another example of where these narratives that are driven by polarized media in the UK as well as the US create these often quite fallacious narratives. The UK spends about 12% of its national income on the welfare state, the same now as it has done, frankly, for a very long time. It's spending it in a different way, and there are reasons why some of the spending is divisive. There is clearly a mental health issue, but actually people are going on to disability benefits because the other bits of the system aren't working. And again, those numbers which showed really kind of quite high levels of kind of people thinking that essentially, there's too many benefit scroungers out there. That's another example, I think, of where, the politics, that the political narrative is sort of setting up targets to explain and justify the ills of our society, which are frankly driven by a productivity crisis. And that creates very fertile ground for populists to kind of create and drive these tropes, which they, judging on these immigration numbers, appear to be doing very successfully. So I will stop there.
Brilliant, Peter, and thank you for battling through that cold and as I'd expect from someone from the FT, grounding what I think is a long-running social crisis, which has its origins in an economic crisis, which probably began back in 2008, 2009. And I suspect we're all more tolerant, liberal, and inclusive when we feel like our standard of living rises each year, and when it stops. That perhaps is an explanation to some of the polarization that we're increasingly beginning to see. And also your connection to what Jocelyn said about perhaps the liberal and the left have left open a big space into which reform and Trump under the Republicans has kind of sort of merrily walked. But Sophie, perhaps you now bring us some real insight on the work that you've been doing on the Reform Party itself. So, Reform voters. So, Sophie, all over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the things this report makes really clear is that, you know, the UK's kind of centre of gravity on these issues is quite different. Obviously, sometimes more conservative, sometimes more liberal, but particularly on those kinds of classic moral questions, the UK does tend to be in a more kind of liberal place than the US. So, you know, same-sex marriage, contraception, abortion, those type of things. And so I think as a result, Reform's voters are more liberal than kind of Republicans, than Trump's MAGA base, in quite a few different ways. And actually what we see in our research, we did some work with UK and a Change in Europe on Reform voters earlier this year, is that Reform voters are actually kind of broadly in line with median public opinion on those questions. They're not particularly more conservative, maybe slightly, but they generally kind of reflect the status quo of where people are on those issues in this country. And the exception to that is, as the NatCen report points out as well, trans rights, which kind of is a bit more of a live issue, does fall into that kind of, I guess you would call it a woke versus common sense binary that we're kind of having in politics now, which is quite live here. And Reform is a party then whose kind of voters are pretty united in their more socially conservative issues, values, even if they're not quite as conservative as in the US, Republicans in the US. But actually, moral drivers aren't kind of that's not the driver of that vote coalition. I should say that's not really the key to Reform's success. Actually, the big driver is just dissatisfaction with the status quo and a lot of people looking for a political alternative. I think that's embodied by the fact that a lot of Reform's voters are just generally fed up to different extents, and with different kinds of institutions. So, you know, the government, party establishment, they feel like ordinary people don't get recognition they deserve, they don't get their fair share of the country's wealth. You know, the government simply can't get anything done, and can't tackle the big issues of the day. That's, I think, demonstrated most clearly in their attitudes towards migration. We saw in the report Reform voters are particularly hardline on that issue. And, you know, they vary in how radical they think the solutions to those problems are. Some of them want to burn everything down and start all over again. Others prefer much more gradual piecemeal change. Some want a more interventionist state, others don't. But they are united by that more kind of nativistic approach to politics and concerns around that fundamental question of fairness. And that politics is pretty secular, but it is also quite broad. And so I think that allows Reform to really hold together quite a wide, sort of maybe slightly fragile coalition with lots of conflicting views on tax, welfare, net zero, foreign policy, but they do share those more conservative social values, even if they're not that particularly conservative compared to the rest of the UK population. And that's maybe one of the reasons why Nigel Farage is so much more keen to talk about migration or, you know, social issues. He kind of made a bit of an off-the-cuff mention of potentially changing the UK's abortion law a few months ago, because his base is more united on those questions than a lot of other policy areas. But I think to think that is the main driver of Reform's success, you know, that social conservatism, is, I think, to misunderstand where the average Briton is, to misunderstand where the average Reform voter is, and actually to underestimate how much just that basic feeling that nothing is working and the country is essentially broken really plays in Reform's rise. And I think that's really key to bear in mind about the UK political context in particular.
Brilliant, Sophie, thank you. I clearly need a lesson in how to turn my audio and video back on more brilliant quickly. So look, thank you, really, really insightful, really appreciate that. We're going to finish with Mark. I'm going to challenge Mark, because he did this last week, to finish with a note of optimism for us people who probably sit slightly to the liberal and feel a bit depressed. So Mark, to you.
Well, obviously, I'm having worked for the BBC for such a long time. I have no views about anything, so I can't look positively or negatively in relation to what you just said. But I'd like, first of all, to say that I think it's a really interesting project, because people are different in different places. One feels it as soon as one gets off an aeroplane, or even in the UK, gets off a train, within 10 minutes, you can sort of tell that this place is different. The people are different and they think differently. And I do think that when people are approached by pollsters and they're asked a question about, say, immigration, they will answer it in a social, a political, and a cultural context. So countries have their national stories, their histories, which frame people's sense of what's important, what the priorities are. There are obviously social norms, and they help people decide how best to respond to questions from pollsters. What is it right or okay to say at the moment? And there is a kind of zeitgeist in this. I mean, as Jocelyn was saying, this isn't a static story. It is a trend story, but it is two other things as well. I think it has a historical context, and we've touched a little bit on that in terms of the bigger story of the US and the UK. And I think it also, frankly, has a day-to-day context, which is, what's in the news and what's on my social media feed. So I think when we're looking at all this data, we have to bear all that in mind. On the face of it, as Peter was suggesting, Nigel Farage might well be thinking that on immigration, he is pushing at something of an open door, with UK voters, on the basis of this comparison, seemingly much more in favour of deportation of those in the country illegally, something his party has put very high up its list of priorities, and people less likely to recognize the benefits of immigration, apparently, than their American cousins. And we've discussed the different histories. You've got one big continental country built by immigrants and a relatively small island. So there are real differences. But what I wanted to say is, there is NatCen data and survey data from a range of other sources that, to my mind, suggest the UK populace is not as hard line on this issue as the UK-US comparison might indicate. So the comparative data we are discussing today asks a question about whether a diverse population strengthens or weakens society. And as discussed, a significantly lower proportion of Brits than Americans thought it strengthened society, 49 against 64. But NatCen likes to ask questions in this area, and it usually asks the question in a slightly different way. Along with other questions on the economy and on jobs, we ask if cultural life is undermined or enriched by immigration. And the latest data, which is the survey work was only done this summer, finds that 68% of people in Britain say they think immigration has enriched the country, with just 24% offering a negative view. So that's 68 against 49, depending how you ask the question. So my point is, really attitudes are quite difficult to get at, certainly when it comes to immigration, quite difficult to pin down. What does seem to me clear from the long-term trend data is that the UK is still much more positive about immigration than it has been, certainly if you go back to the 1990s or the 2000s. Even since Brexit, there has been a broadly more positive view of immigrants and immigration, albeit we've had a few polls suggest a relatively modest level of additional concern in the last couple of years. I have been looking at the very latest data. I don't think it's published yet, but I can exclusively reveal a few of the numbers. So back in 1995, NatCen's British Social Attitude Survey found a Britain which was really troubled. Just 16% of people in that survey, 95, thought immigrants were generally good for the economy. If you ask that question this summer, what answer do you get? 50%, 50, agreed that they're best, that they've been good for the economy, less than a quarter disagreeing. Do they take jobs from British workers? Another measure. Well, more than half of people in Britain, according to the latest NatCen survey, said no, they don't think so. Less than a quarter agreed with that proposition. And the cultural impact, as I say, 68% of those in the survey thought migrants had actually enriched the country, with just 24% holding a negative view. So I think, we just have to be careful that we don't allow a sort of narrative to run, which may not actually be backed up when you really try and get to what people are really thinking about this. Another area that we've talked about is the relationship between British voters and the state. Well, clearly the post-war settlement in the UK, notably creating our beloved NHS, has embedded a cultural sense that it is the government's job to deal with the country's needs. And I think the figures from this survey definitely bear that out. Yes, we moan, we groan about how well they're doing that. Again, the survey suggests, well, we're pretty tough on government. We really expect them to get to grips with this. Record dissatisfaction with the health service at the moment, but there's very little attitude to actually kill it off. In fact, NatCen data from last year, 6 in 10 people said they were very or quite dissatisfied with the NHS. That was a record level, really, really worrying. But strong majority support for the founding principles, with 90% of people saying it should be free at the point of use, 77% said it should be available to everyone, 80% funded from general taxation. So no sign that we're looking to move to a smaller state on that. On the social liberalism, sort of conservatism stuff, well, NatCen's time series on these liberal attitudes on issues like abortion, contraception, same-sex marriage, they reveal, to my mind, quite an extraordinary and dramatic liberalizing of Britain in really quite a short time. If you go back to the 1980s, even the 1990s, moving into this century, you find very, very different attitudes. Things have moved very quickly. And what's interesting, UK appears to be something of an outlier on these measures. Other international comparisons find Britain among the most tolerant country in the world. If you ask the question, the World Values Survey has been looking at this. If you ask them, who don't you want to have as a neighbor? Immigrants, people who have AIDS, unmarried couples, people of a different religion, people who speak a different language. And you look, Britain in almost every single one of those measures is the most tolerant, the most accepting. So as Sophie suggested, I think the social conservatism which underpins some of what Reform and Nigel Farage are about may well actually grate with voters who perhaps regard the party currently more as a way of putting 2 fingers up to traditional politics than necessarily offering a blueprint for government. I don't know, Michael, whether that was the kind of positivity that you were looking for, but that's my reflection on this, that maybe it's a bit more complicated than some of these bald comparative numbers are suggesting.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask all of the presenters to turn on their cameras. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the questions that have come through on the Q&A, and also colleagues in the NatCen team have also put on some questions. And so what I'm going to do is just sort of try out a few questions with you all. First off, I'm going to turn to Jocelyn and Curtis. Now, I've been Chief Executive of NatCen for just over 15 months, and I'm incredibly proud of the robustness that the NatCen team take in terms of our approach to data collection. And I know from my former life of the kind of the rigor and expertise that Pew put into theirs. So we've had a few questions about age, about gender, and I just wondered, perhaps putting Curtis and Jocelyn on the spot, could you first off just tell a little bit about how you both do the data collection and whether or not you can see things around gender or age in the data? And perhaps we've not had the chance to sort of analyze it yet. So let me say, Curtis, can I ask you first?
Sure. Yeah. I saw the question, and I think all of the items that the person who asked the question asked about age, gender, ethnicities, all items that we collect in the survey, and we started to do some basic analysis of that. So you heard when I was talking through the results that we looked at the impact of religion on our sort of socially progressive or conservative attitudes. We looked at whether ethnicity was playing a role on people's attitudes to immigration and ethnic diversity. So we started doing that. One of the next stages of this research that we're hoping to get out early next year maybe is digging a little bit deeper into this. So we've obviously looked at the top level of the differences or similarities between the UK and the US. But what I think we want to take a little bit further is looking at the associations within that. So differences in attitudes between younger and older people or similarities. And are those patterns and distributions and associations similar in the UK and the US, or actually are there different patterns emerging? I mean, there's a lot of discussion, for example, about the role of young men and their attitudes to politics. And I don't know whether we'll quite have the sample size to go into that level of detail, but there's a sense perhaps that things are changing and the normal associations are breaking down, certainly in the UK, as politics is fragmenting. So that's one of the things that we want to look at next. So yes, we have that data. No, we haven't. Yes, we've started looking at it, but no, we haven't maybe done quite as much as we'd like to.
Brilliant, thank you, Curtis. Jocelyn.
Yes, I'll say the same. We our data collection involves we collect all of those demographics and so many more, and and I'm sure just as NatCen does, we're rigorous about ensuring that we are representing all of those groups in our data, and that there's a lot of technical work that goes into weighting the data appropriately to represent the population, and we do often look at how do these issues differ across racial and ethnic groups, across age groups, across gender, across religious groups, and the short story is they often do, but not in a systematic way, right? So for instance, I'll just take gender. In the US, there is a long-standing gender gap in our politics, where women are more likely than men to have a Democratic leaning. Conversely, men are more likely than women to have a Republican leaning. That's not absolute. There are plenty of, it's still fairly close to 50-50 among both groups. But on some issues, and perhaps not surprisingly, especially issues around gender, that gap is wider than on other issues. And the same thing is true of other demographics. And as Curtis mentioned, one of the things we're attentive to are these things changing. So that's work that we do on this project, on other projects. We do a lot of work on who voted, what groups voted. So for instance, as many of you likely know, in the US in the 2024 election, we saw that Trump's 2024 coalition was more racially and ethnically diverse than his 2016 and 2020 coalitions. That said, for the most part, Black Americans are heavily Democratic. Hispanic Americans have a Democratic lean, but less so than they used to. Asian Americans also have a Democratic lean. And so these are the kinds of things that we're constantly looking into in our data. So if there are specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. But the short answer is yes, we do have all of that information.
Brilliant, thank you, Jocelyn. Sophie, if I might come to you. So one of the things that I think we think on the, if you like, the British side is that there's a very strong moral and social underpinning to the Republican movement that is very deep. It's formed over many sort of years. So the question that's come in is, and you touched on it, is the coalition that comes behind reform, do you think it's deep enough to hold over the next 5 or 10 years, or is it really just wrapped up in a dissatisfaction with life and immigration? And if those two things were solved, in inverted brackets, the kind of the support for reform would go away in the way that we assume that the Republican movement would carry on because its roots are much deeper. So I think my question is, how deep do you think the reform roots are in British society? Sophie, if that's not too hard.
I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and I think a good parallel almost, albeit on probably a slightly smaller scale, is the coalition that Boris Johnson built after the 2019 general election here. We actually had a lot of people in that voter coalition who had never voted Conservative before, a lot of those voters in the Red Wall who decided to lend the Tories their vote to get Brexit done and get us out of the EU once and for all. And that was a coalition that was united by, wanting to leave the EU. It also did share some views on migration and so on. But actually, if you dug underneath that and looked at their views on, tax and spend, welfare, climate, they all actually pointed in quite different directions. And those red wall voters in particular were much more in favour of kind of state intervention, redistributive economic policy than a lot of, the traditional Conservative voters who had stuck with the party. I think Reform has a similar issue in that actually what we see in our work is that, they're quite united on migration being an important issue, but actually the kind of perspectives they come at that within that coalition are quite different. You've got a core who are much more concerned about sort of the cultural consequences of migration, if you could call it that, the impact on national identity. They would be more concerned about, the UK becoming increasingly diverse. They have concerns about cultural integration and so on. And then you've got the kind of other chunk of Reform voters who sure think that could be an issue, but they're actually primarily concerned about the impact on public services of having a growing population. How much does it cost to keep these asylum hotels going? They've got slightly different concerns there. And then you obviously pile on top of that the fact that, just as with Boris Johnson's voter coalition in 2019, they've got very diverse preferences when it comes to economic policy and whether they would rather grow the state or actually close the gap between rich and poor as a priority. They come at that from very distinct preferences. So I think there is a question of, if we suddenly snapped our fingers and the cost of living crisis is solved and net migration reduces to the hundreds of thousands and there's no more boats crossing the channel, I think that does make things difficult for Reform because it forces them to actually spell out a policy programme that could be potentially actually quite divisive to a lot of its base. And I think that's been really evident in that actually, if you look at the policies that Farage and Co have sort of spelt out so far, they almost like zigzag around the political spectrum, if that makes sense. You've got, greater protections for trade unions, but you've got cutting net zero to put billions of pounds in public services, but then you've also got opposition to increases in corporation tax and things like that. So very kind of incoherent policy programme. And I think that is because it is relatively shallow. That base is very kind of thin, but very broad. It just does make it harder to keep going. And I do think it is thinner than the Republicans' base in the US.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sophie. I'm going to turn this one for Mark and Peter because it's a media one. I perhaps this is my own naivety or naive hope. I like sort of, again, Jocelyn's concept of the thermometer. So we kind of lean in one direction and then we think it's gone too far. So we kind of sort of come back into the center. But is the media capable of doing that? Or is the media itself becoming, in the UK, more and more polarized? So perhaps, Peter, to pick up from where you said of coming back from the Washington desk to the UK, perhaps if I ask you, Peter, first, has our media landscape changed to a point where it can't help us get back to the centre ground and it will just keep pushing us off to the left, to the right? We're now in a pentagon shape, I think, because we've got 5 political parties for England at least. What's your take on what the media will do over the next 3 to 4 years?
Unmuted. I think you put your finger on it there about the 5 political parties. In a first past the post system, you can win with really, if your electoral chips fall the right way, with really quite small majorities. We saw it with Starmer, 170 seat majority, winning with 33.8, Stove, you'll correct me, percent of the vote. Corbyn lost with 38 or 39%, right? So the motivation, if the media serves constituencies, the motivation to go into the middle ground is reduced by the fact that you don't win from the middle ground necessarily anymore. It is possible that Farage wins from the right. You've got a populist on the left in Polanski. You've got the left vote split 3 ways, and the Conservatives increasingly marginalised. And therefore, actually, I think it's very unlikely. 2 things. One, when you look at the country and you look at the fiscal position and you look at the speed at which investments flow, investment which the Labour government, to be fair, is clinging on to, flows into delivery. The idea that the sense that all is not well in the land is going to evaporate seems to me extremely unlikely. And then you look at it tactically. Farage, he's got to 30-odd%, right? He doesn't need 45%, which is what you need in America, right? And so then the question is more, if Farage can get to 33-34%, which is what Starmer did to win his majority, propelled by social media, GB News, a pretty right-wing paper press, then the powers that lie behind the throne have no motivation to go back into the centre, and that's why I think, slightly to contradict Mark about his optimism, the numbers he's quoting is the whole country. No one is suggesting these numbers suggest the whole country has these views, but actually that's the right. Reform Plus Tories have these very right-wing views on immigration, and it's because they've been encouraged, just like they were told, leave the EU and all will be grand again. Buccaneering Britain will set forth, we're being held back by the EU. They're now being told, get Johnny Foreigner out, and we'll find our mojo again, and old John Bull and Blighty will be great again, right? I mean, I'm being facetious, but sort of deliberately, right? Because these are picking targets, and as Sophie says, there is no particularly sophisticated policy agenda. Like all good populists, they appeal to all their constituencies. Anyway, on that depressing note, hopefully Mark can convince us that that's totally wrong.
Mark?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm going to try and do that. Now, of course, you're absolutely right, Peter, that there is an emboldened right within our country, and they're emboldened by the fact that even mainstream politicians now talk about immigration in a way that would have been unheard of certainly 20 years ago. So that has changed the argument. John Curtis is very strong about the sort of breakdown in the two-party system, but he points to the sort of traditional sort of left-right divide, if you like, on the economy, but the idea of sort of the social divide being much more difficult to sort of work out. And I think we are in slightly sort of uncharted territory now. Certainly, I think the role of social media means that sort of almost trope that in the end political parties will win if they're closest to the middle ground, that we are a kind of MOR kind of population. It's going to be interesting to see in the next election whether that is true. The one thing that I would say is, it always surprises me because I don't know how on earth it happens, but there is a sense in which the British electorate, whether it's voting tactically or I don't know how they do it, but they kind of very often seem to get the answer that they actually were trying to get, even though it's one person, one vote. So it will be very interesting to see, and I don't know the answer is really my short response, but it'll be very interesting to see the extent to which the British public do something which historically they are disinclined to do, which is really back revolutionaries. We tend to be much more likely to try and find someone who's just going to, sort of keep everything a little bit calm and carry on.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. I mean, one of the things I think we've touched on is in the UK, we're faced with the prospect of sort of 5 political parties. In England, you add in Plaid Cymru for Wales, Scottish Nationalist Party in Scotland. So you've got a kind of 7 potential political parties, all could do really well in 2029. But in the US, all of those versions of views in a country that's much, much, much bigger than the United Kingdom still holds around a 2-party system. So, Jocelyn, from your perspective, do you have a theory as to why we're atomizing into lots of different parties as we become more polarized? But despite all of the differences within the US, you still hang on to 2 parties?
Well, there's a structural, there's a simple structural explanation to that. There is often a lot of energy in the US, or let me put it this way: there's not a lot of love for either of the 2 parties, and that is true not just at this moment. It's been true to some extent for the last decade or so. It's not always been true, right? We're in this profoundly long period of low trust in the federal government here in the US, and ratings of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are far worse than they were if we go back 30 years, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The public ratings of those parties were more positive, not necessarily glowing, but more positive. And yet, why do they persist? And it's because, you know, we also have a first past the post system, but we really have this first past the post system, right? We don't have a parliamentary system. We don't. So even when there are groups within there are factions within or that try to arise, the most common way that gets resolved is that there's a kind of internal party battle to figure out which parts of the coalition rise to the top. And one can make the argument, for instance, in the US, that the Trump coalition, the Trump part of the Republican Party, which is not the same thing as the whole party. So, to Zoe's point about reform, it's also true that Trump voters in the US are a pretty diverse group. There are some true believers, but there are a lot of people who voted for Trump but don't necessarily have that strong attachment. That's an aside, but I think it reflects that there are coalitions within the parties and they rise and fall, but there's still the Republican Party label, or there's still the Democratic Party label. And there might be some realignment happening, but it's a slow process. We just don't have a system that allows for a third party to pop up and perform well. But it does lead to these interesting dynamics. We're more polarized than ever, but people are more upset that there's not more middle ground than ever. Both things can be true, right? And I think that leads to like a real sense of negativity about our politics, again, that we've seen, really grow over the course of the last 10 or 15 years.
Right, brilliant, thank you. We're getting close to time, so I'm just going to do a couple just to sort of finish off, if I may, quite sort of quick fire ones. Sophie, perhaps one for you first. So what we've seen in terms of reform voters, versus Trump voters, as it were, is a much stronger stance in terms of immigration, much tougher position on that, but actually still very liberal around same-sex marriage. And sort of more social issues, just generally more liberal. Is there anything in the work that you've done that suggests that reform voters would move back on that and so would start to become more pro-family, more religious Christian in nationalistic in their views, or do you think their views are pretty set and it's very much an immigration and dissatisfaction with the state?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is that it's relatively set. And I mean, obviously, that could be a function of the fact that we just don't tend to have debates around those issues in this country in particular, abortion, same-sex marriage, kind of feel like settled questions, I think, to a great extent. And so maybe it's just that lack of political discourse is the reason they feel so solid. And if reform do bring up those topics more and put them on the table for discussion, then they might become, more conservative, they might shift. So I think it's difficult to kind of untangle the connection between the engagement we have with those issues and kind of political attitudes. The reason my instinct is that I think attitudes are relatively hard to set there is that if you compare them to something like trans rights, for example, you can really see the distinction. Trans rights are a much more kind of live issue where there has been that shift, which kind of makes me think if we're having that discussion around those issues, around trans rights, single-sex spaces and that type of discussion, then we already would have seen some knock-on impact on support for same-sex marriage. I think that's one of the things I would presume. I think the other thing is that what we know from our work is that particular at times of economic crisis, when people are feeling the pinch and finding it hard to get by, the attitudes tend to become much more zero-sum, and that's played a big part in across the population. The UK attitudes to migration hardening, as Mark said, they had previously actually been heading in the opposite direction, and in the last kind of 18 months we've seen them become kind of more conservative and more hardline once again, and that is partially because of the impact of the cost of living crisis and people viewing that through kind of the prism of economic resources. we would presume that would have a kind of similar knock-on impact with kinds of social attitudes, and people will become more hardline on those in turn, but they haven't yet. And so because we've not seen that knock-on impact, my instinct is that they're pretty hard set and won't move. But as I said, if reform bring them to the table, then maybe we'll see some shift that's led from the top.
Brilliant, thank you, Sophie. And then Mark and Peter to finish. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to force a role reversal on you both. So, Mark, I'm going to ask you what worries you from what you've heard this afternoon, and he's going to give you a sleepless night. And Peter, I'm going to force you to be optimistic, which is really hard, I know, because you're full of cold. But where would you look for optimism in what we've seen today? And I guess we're all probably wishing we could all be a bit more in the centre ground. So, Mark, first, your permission to be pessimistic and downtrodden.
No, well, look, I mean, it is quite a troubling time for the UK. That's undoubtedly true. I encounter it just purely by being a member of the dreaded MSM. I get quite a lot of incoming from people whose opinions and settled views about things are being decided in a completely unregulated world of social media, where facts are lost and replaced by all kinds of lies and misinformation. So that is a huge worry for me. And I think, yes, I'm trying. Yes, I do think that narrative is really important in this. If the way people respond, the way people feel about what they are allowed to say and the views that they're allowed to articulate are decided really by the sort of broader national conversation and the kind of rules under which that is held. And I think my sort of anxiety is that it is a completely anarchic world in social media, or can be, and that may throw up all kinds of problems when we come to using our traditional democratic systems for trying to decide who should run the country. Yeah, that would be my negative, my concern, and I'm just desperately interested to hear Peter being positive, because it would be lovely.
Peter, over to you.
Flipping Nora. I think we do live in a very negative time, and a lot of the structural factors are very negative, and there's not many good reasons to think it's going to get much better. We've just been through the whole Brexit populist scenario, and the guy who's top of the pops is the guy who bought you that. But I'm 53 years of age. I grew up in the 1970s when the lights didn't work and all the rest of it, and so my positive take is that these things go in cycles, right? And unless you want to get into a really doom-laden piece about the actual kind of the structural decline of post-industrial societies, actually, I love this concept of the thermostatic opinion poll, right? And one has to have faith, if you've been through a few of these cycles, that these things will go round. And I think Mark's right. The great British public, in the whole, and that maybe we need a correction to our electoral system, right? Maybe people realize that our electoral system is throwing up a load of things that they don't want. We may have to go through the process of that system throwing up and live through the things that we don't want. A Farage premiership, it might be brilliant, but if it doesn't deliver, then maybe but Johnson and Truss, say what you like, didn't deliver, right? Didn't deliver the levelling up agenda, didn't deliver which is why we are where we are now. So that's my positive take, that the wheel will turn. It may mean that we need adjustments, but we'll get there in the end. Always do.
Brilliant, thank you, Peter. So let me draw us all to a close there. Let me first again thank Peter for he and I having lunch and coming up with this as an idea. Thank you to Curtis for turning it into a proper research and rigorous research proposal, and also to colleagues at Pew. This has been a great collaboration to share with you, and I'd welcome the opportunity to look at other things in the future. Thank you to Sophie for the work that you've been doing looking at the reform voters. I think that's really added great value today. And Mark, for continuing to be cheerful. But you did say I can't even say the word anarchistic, which is quite a revolutionary term. So look, thank you all, and thank you to the NatCen team in the background who have helped put all today together. I think we will definitely, as Curtis has said, look at some more of this data, and so long as it holds together by age, by gender, by ethnicity, and we hope to publish some more of that in the new year. But other than that, thank you all very much for attending, and have a good rest